Let's go over the cost of starting a dairy sheep operation on the homestead scale. If you want to start a commercial dairy, that's a whole other thing. I'm Natalie Lucier from Waykeeper Farm and Nerdery, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some real numbers of what it cost us to get started in dairy sheep. The numbers you'll see are in Canadian dollars, and you might find that if you're in the US or somewhere else that you have either a more affordable option or just more options to choose from that might be a completely different number than what we got. So let's dive right in. So the first thing you need is obviously land or property for your sheep, and I'm going to assume that you already have that because that's going to be a whole different thing to start calculating. But usually you will need at least several acres for your sheep to graze unless you're doing something like a confined setup for your sheep. But I really feel like you end up saving more in terms of feed and also just having healthy animals if you let them graze and you do more rotational grazing. So the biggest cost of getting into dairy sheep is the sheep themselves. So you might have different options that are available to you. Definitely do your research on this. If you're getting ewes that have already been bred and are already in milk, you'll pay more for that as well. And rams tend to be a little bit more expensive too. So when we first bought our sheep, we paid $450 for a ewe lamb. That meant she was not of breeding age. And then we also brought in 2 freshened ewes at $800. We decided to get freshened ewes so that we didn't have to have lambing on our farm first thing out of the gate, and that gave us time to get used to milking sheep and making sure we actually wanted milking sheep to do that whole work of milking them before we went all the way and bred the next crop of lambs. The first young ram we bought was also $450, and then we also got him a wether or a castrated friend that kept him company, and that was $300. Now costs will vary based on the breed, the genetics, and also who's selling the sheep. So we recently bought a ram that was $1,800, and it was that expensive because he has genetics coming directly from France and they did artificial insemination, and so we're hoping that their babies will have even more milk production. So that's something that you need to consider too, is if you're just getting started, you want to test this out, you don't have to spend a ton on the best ram or the best ewes that you can find near you. You can definitely invest over time and just start with something to make sure you actually want to do this. Now this is really important. You can't just get one sheep or one ewe because sheep are herd animals and they need to socialize. So let's say that you want at least 2 ewes, and also if you are going to go with a ram and a wether, that means you can keep them together as well when you're not in that breeding season. So using the original numbers that we were able to buy sheep for, you might be looking at about $1,650 for your sheep. Now let's talk about transportation. So chances are that these sheep are not going to be living right next door to you. So you might need to have them transported to you. And if you already have, a truck or a trailer or something to really do that safely, then you're probably good to go. You just have to pay for the cost of gas. But in our case, we didn't have any of that. We just have a regular small car, and we have tried putting a sheep in there, but I do not recommend it. So what we ended up doing is we got lucky. Our neighbors have a trailer that they use to move their horses, so they were more than happy to go and pick up our sheep for us, and we covered the gas and their time expenses as well. Now, if you don't know anyone who can transport your sheep for you, then definitely look up animal transport services. So these are services where they have trucks with different sections so that they can bring different groups of animals from one place to another. And if you're not sure where to find them, obviously you could do a search online, but what you'll want to do is maybe contact different slaughterhouses or different butcher areas so you can find out who's bringing the animals there to be processed so that maybe you can get in touch with those drivers and those trucks. Now it's hard to estimate how close the sheep are to you and what costs are for trucks and hiring and all of things, so I'm just gonna put $400 for now. Now we get to lodging for your sheep. So if you already have a barn or another sort of structure that they can use, then you're good to go. And we were pretty lucky in that respect because we did have a small barn and a big barn, and we just needed enough space to get started with our 4 sheep. So I recommend at least having something to keep them out of the elements when it gets either too hot, too cold, too windy, too rainy. And you'll probably want something that's also mobile, so when you're grazing them out in the field, you can actually move that with them too. Now, I don't know if you're able to get something that does that, at the store, but we ended up building something ourselves, and we spent about $200 on that project, not including our time. Next, we get into fencing costs. So fencing does tend to be probably the second most expensive thing to having livestock animals. And there's a lot of options. I have a whole other video about fencing options for sheep here, but here's what you need to know. You can start with more mobile options that aren't as permanent and that tend to be a little bit more affordable too. So we went with electric sheep netting in the beginning, and we still use it every day when we're rotating them out in pasture. So it's a good investment that you'll use over time. But it's also great because it doesn't have to be set up permanently. So if you're not quite sure where you want your long-term winter area to be, or you don't know how many sheep you're gonna have and how to subdivide things, then it's a great way to start. Now, depending on what options you have available, we spent about $300 for one sheep net, and it worked pretty well. But the thing is, you need more than one, because if you're going to rotate, you need to have your next section set up so you can move your sheep to it. So I recommend at least getting 2 fences that are electric netting, and then you'll also need an energizer, probably a solar panel and a battery setup so that you can really save on charging up your energizer so that those fences stay electrified. So all in all, this might be about another $900. Now for dairy sheep, you might want to buy or build a stanchion, and this is where you want your sheep to go on and maybe eat their grains or their yummy treats while you're milking them. Now this is optional. I've definitely seen people do it without. We went without for about a week, and then we realized, yeah, we really want a stanchion. I think this will make things way easier. So you can have your sheep into your farm and decide if you actually want a stanchion or not, but probably it's good to plan on getting one eventually. We ended up finding some plans online that were for goat milking, and then we adapted them for sheep, and so we built it ourselves, and we spent another $100, $150 on that. Next, we get into hand milking versus machine milking. So you definitely don't need a machine to milk sheep. We hand milked for the entire first season that we had our sheep, and I actually recommend that because then you'll know, how to do it. You'll have all the muscle memory, you know exactly how to do it. And I have a whole video showing you how to milk sheep right here. But here's the thing, eventually you may want to get a milking machine, and some people decide to just get a milking machine right out of the gate because they know they won't do it otherwise. So essentially what we went with is a simple pulse milking machine, and that comes in at about $1,000 US depending on which attachments you get and whether you want to be milking just 1 sheep at a time or 2 sheep at a time. And I have found it to be very worthwhile. I'll put a link below, but it's really cool to know that it's an option even if you don't want to start off with one. Now we come to hay feeders. So this might seem like a really obvious one, and you might be able to build one for really cheap, but we actually didn't use a hay feeder right away when we got our sheep. We just used a big container. We would put our hay in it, and what we realized is that we were wasting so much hay, or at least the sheep were pulling out all the hay, not eating it, ended up pooing on it and sleeping on it and just not eating it. So if you are going to be feeding hay anywhere, make sure to have a hay feeder there to just minimize the waste of the hay. Now you can buy a hay feeder or make one on your own. I've seen options from $50 up to $200, and we did both. We bought some that go on the wall that are really easy to attach, and then we've also built one for our outdoor area in the winter. Finally, I have buckets to give water and food with, and this might seem like not a big deal, but you will want, if you have 4 sheep, at least 8 buckets. It might seem kind of silly, but if you want to make sure they have water both in the barn and out in the field, if you want to make sure that you're able to give them grains and not be running back and forth to get buckets all the time, I think it's just good to have. So let's say the buckets cost about $30 so that they're kind of sturdy, then you might be looking at about $240 for buckets. Now, a lot of the things that I talked about are physical things like buckets and hay feeders and things like that. Even fencing, those are things you might be able to get secondhand or used, or even things that people don't want anymore. So I highly recommend keeping an eye out on marketplaces and all kinds of places that you might be able to find these, so you don't have to invest new for all of these things. So adding up everything I've talked about using my estimates, you might be looking at about a $4,750 investment to get started on a small scale scale with dairy sheep. And again, this is Canadian dollars, so that might be even smaller if you're in US dollars, for example, or depending on where you are, you might have different options that are more affordable or maybe even more expensive. So these are only the upfront costs of starting with sheep. So this doesn't include vet bills, feed, or shearing. And these are all things that you'll want to consider long-term on an ongoing basis too. It's always nice to know what you're getting into, and it's no different when it comes to adding animals to your homestead or your farm. So you really need to consider if these costs are a worthwhile investment to you, especially because this is not just a one and done. There are ongoing maintenance costs. You might be bringing new animals to the farm eventually. There's just always going to be more costs associated with any project that you take on, especially if it's living beings like sheep. Now, our sheep are definitely not a commercial endeavor, but there are ways to offset their costs. We do save a lot of money on milk and dairy products, and we've also sold lambs. But the math doesn't always add up. So if you're considering getting dairy sheep because you want to save money, that may not be the case depending on your situation and what you're able to get going. Now, I'd love to hear in the comments what your sheep startup costs were like. And this is especially important because I feel like each region will have different startup costs, and you might be able to discover other people in your area. So definitely leave a comment below if you have sheep or dairy sheep and what it was like to get started for your homestead. And it also gives a more realistic and rounded example from different locations. Now watch my next video all about which breeds to consider for both meat and milk.